This video will be part one of my coverage of William James and his Psychology of Consciousness for PSY 230 Personality Theory. William James is probably one of the most influential psychologists, although he wasn't considered a psychologist necessarily at the time. And his influence is so broad and so deep that your authors felt a need in your chapter to create a graphic that shows just the layers and layers of impact that he had. Most introductory psychology courses do mention William James, particularly in chapters on consciousness, but they rarely do justice to the level of influence that James had on important psychologists, including some of those that we've already studied in your class. James is, if you want to categorize his impacts, he had an educational impact. He introduced the teaching of psychology and doing research in psychology to the academic world in the United States. He had already been thinking about and writing about consciousness, partly from a philosophical perspective, but also from kind of a scientific approach before people like Breuer and Freud were talking about it in academic and medical circles. Since the 1960s, many researchers have kind of come back full circle to many of James's original arguments about the nature of human experience and the nature of human consciousness, as some of his ideas started to dovetail with kind of the ethos of the 1960s. He described himself as a quote-unquote moral psychologist, and one of his most influential pieces of writing had to do with really making the philosophical argument that it is impossible for science to be without value judgment. And he argued that this was the case because human beings are incapable of behaving without reflecting on their own experiences and their own values. James' major works, such as the Principles of Psychology, The Will to Believe, and his work on pragmatism and religious experiences, continue to be studied not just in psychology but also in philosophy. Now, before we dig into some of his theoretical ideas, where did this guy come from? William James came from privilege. He was born in New England in 1842, so kind of wrap your head around the time frame there of when he was born and when he would have grown up in the United States on the East Coast. He initially studied medicine at Harvard, but was restless. He was well-traveled. He studied in Germany and France. He was fluent in both German and French, and was well-read. Beyond his medical interests, he read philosophy, he read about art, he studied art briefly with thoughts about pursuing it as a career. He eventually returned to Harvard, got his medical degree, taking a position in teaching at Harvard, where he really started to blossom in terms of his psychology interests. He developed the first course in American psychology on physiological psychology, which kind of has its tendrils into early thinking in Germany and other parts of Europe and in Russia at the time. Principles of Psychology was published in 1878, and as I mentioned already, remains influential. I read excerpts from it as a part of my History of Psychology course when I was an undergraduate student. In terms of broad impacts as his career unfolded, his writing about consciousness and his studies of consciousness with real people it has been considered to be foundational for what would later become clinical and counseling psychology. And there are lots of reasons for that. I think it'll become clearer why that is as we get into some of his the basics of his theory. His work, though, has broad influence both inside the science of psychology and outside of it. He is often referred to among parapsychologists, people who study, extrasensory perception and things like that, which go beyond the experiences that are traditionally studied in psychology. He's also influential within kind of the mystical, transpersonal realms, which are like this interesting hybrid of the study of religion and psychology. To that point, he was very interested in what he called transcendent experiences. You're going to read more and learn more about transcendent experience when we study people like Abraham Maslow, who also shared an interest in transformational psychological experiences that involve altered states of consciousness. In addition to kind of influencing people like Maslow, it was also influential in later developments of things that are very ubiquitous in our culture, such as the way in which pastors and priests are trained to do counseling work, or in programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. During the last part of his life, he did lecture more and more on metaphysics and philosophy. He was especially interested in the philosophical tradition of pragmatism. He was, even during his lifetime, a very well-respected psychologist and was twice president of the APA, which shows, despite the fact that he wrote extensively in non-scientific areas and received some criticism for doing so, his work in psychology, particularly in physiological psychology and the scientific study of consciousness, was well respected, and he as a person, as a thinker, was well respected. Among his major concepts, one theme is going to be evident throughout, is his interest in consciousness. He did, though, show interest, and in his work, whether he was writing philosophically or working in the laboratory, he was interested in all things related to human psychology. As your authors note, he was interested in everything from the way the brain and the nervous system function, which would be today referred to as neuroscience. He was also interested in the deeply personal way in which people talk about their religious experiences, their metaphysical experiences, and so on. And he crossed that boundary, that really fuzzy gray area boundary of parapsychological research and psychic experiences. In terms of connecting James' major concepts to personality theory, he believed that personality comes out of this very complicated. On one level it's complex, but on another level it makes complete sense. He believed that human beings are biological, there are instincts, but we are also learning creatures, we develop habits, but we are also thinking creatures, we make choices. And it's the interaction between all of those elements, that's where human personality comes from. So in part, the instinct, the bio part, is you're a human organism, with certain kinds of evolutionary instincts that shape your behavior. At the same time, your world shapes your experiences by teaching you certain habits. And finally, you do have the capacity to exercise choice. And your personality is a complex mixture of those three areas. He looked at individual differences, things like developmental stages, the emergence of problems in behavior, problems in psychological experience, all of that as building blocks that you could look at them in the person. Those are all building blocks of who they are as individuals, but you can also look at it as at the species level. So nature, the world as it exists, over long, long periods of time, your authors mentioned slowly refined by evolution, he was very interested in evolutionary theory and used evolutionary concepts and ideas to shape his major ideas. He did believe that you have to be pluralistic in your thinking. You have to be able to tap into and use more than one theory at a time. And that was kind of, a revolutionary idea at the time. There was a lot of siloing. There was a lot of segmentation. He thought that doing that would interfere with your creativity and your ability to see what you might be missing. Finally, we need to just have a short list of his major concepts. And these are and there's a reason why it has to be a short list, because he wrote so much with so much depth that we have to limit it somehow. So your authors have chosen concepts of the self, elements of consciousness, and how consciousness functions in a cognitive sense as major focus of your chapter. So we'll start with the self and how James operationalized the self. He talked about the self as more than just that thing that functions in consciousness and is you or I. The way we've talked about ego, for example, in Freudian theory, it's very much the you that you look at in the mirror and describe as yourself. He felt that the self was more than that. He felt that it was inextricably woven into the fabric of our biological being, and that our cognitive processes are going to come through the self and then interact with the outside world. He had a very cognitive orientation before there was any such thing as cognitive psychology. So he talks about this idea of filtering thoughts, of deciding how to think and how to interpret the world, before there was any such thing as cognitive science. He starts, like a lot of people from his time period, he starts with the biological. He starts with the self being grounded in our physical bodies, and having a particular hereditary makeup, particular physicality. And it functions like any other biological organism. Like any other animal, human beings are biological organisms with physiological processes. So the self is grounded in that physical self. He argued that there was more than one experience of self. So he describes the material self as the part of the self that is tethered to the physical world, and what you're experiencing in the moment in that physical world. There's also a social self, and here, he's talking like a social psychologist before there was anything in the world called social psychology. He talked about how we engage in our social interactions through role-playing, through adopting roles or being forced into roles, and we modify our behavioral patterns and habits to fit the settings that we are in that are primarily social. But he also felt that there was a metaphysical side to the self, which he referred to as a spiritual self. So there's where you really get into the consciousness piece. It's your inner life, the conversation that you have with yourself about yourself. So it is essentially subjective. And that's where, that inner voice, that spiritual self, whether you're talking about it in religious terms or not, is very tied to his beliefs about consciousness more generally. In terms of characteristics of thought, and some argue that this is, the biggest impact that William James had in terms of being a foundational source of information, source of the eventual development of cognitive psychology, was these ways of characterizing how people think. But he put it in some ways, very philosophical terms. So he talks about the idea that there isn't really a separation between mind and body. individual consciousness, so your personal sense of your conscious awareness, is grounded in the fact that it's in you. So it is personal. And that your authors call this, there's no consciousness, no individual consciousness independent of an owner, independent of a body. So therefore, every thought that you have is uniquely yours. That opens the door for every thought being grounded in how the individual perceives what's happening. So there, he's opening the door for us to say, wait, we have to ask questions about objective reality. And he's saying, no, there's really not that much relevance to the concept of objective reality. It's all about how you are constructing and understanding the world that surrounds you and how you're understanding yourself in it. So consciousness for James is relational. It's not abstract. It's not something ethereal. I mean, there are philosophical traditions in which consciousness is utterly unrelated to the physical body, and the physical body is a figment of our imagination. When we talk about Zen Buddhism later in the semester, that is an argument that's going to be made, is that this perception that we have that there's a physical world, that you have a physical body with all of its flaws and limitations, is something that is false, that it's a fiction that we tell ourselves, and is the grounding point of all of our suffering. Well, James is the opposite. You can't take the consciousness out of the being, out of the physical body of the being, and our consciousness is in fact a product of and a producer of our biological experience. He felt that in terms of science, if we're going to study people, and I provide the quote here, the thinker is the thought. So you can't divorce the thought from the process that made it, and where that process takes place is in the thinker, is in the person. He argued that instead of kind of making this artificial and, from his point of view, relatively useless distinction between mind and body, consciousness should be understood as inherently woven into that body. So he was not a proponent of mind-body separation. Changes in consciousness, obviously you have this experience. You notice changes in your own consciousness at various points in time. James made the argument on philosophical grounds that you never have exactly the same thought more than once. He felt that there was an undeniably constructive nature to our thinking and our conscious awareness of our thinking. Our thoughts are always novel. While they may have echoes and similarities to thoughts we've had before, they're never exactly the same because they're contextualized differently. What seems to be repetitious on the surface, he argued, was actually subtly modified, tweaked here and there to fit the new demands of the new situation and the new demands of the physical body that is producing the thoughts. As a result, each thought that happens in a series of thoughts is going to be modified from that original thought. It's going to have new facets, new information that are brought to it, maybe differences in emotional valence, differences in how they feel to the person, but they will be modified. He felt that this was an absolutely central part of the experience of consciousness, the fact that it's always changing. He was pretty dogged about the fact that this is the way it is. We are constantly in a state of reinvention, and part of that is the fact that our consciousness is always moving and always changeable across time. Now, one construct that I found it on some days when I was studying James as an undergraduate in my history of psychology class, I found it really simple, and then other times I thought it can't be that simple. And where I often got the biggest challenge was this concept of the stream of consciousness. For a healthy, functioning human being, we don't tend to see or experience our consciousness as interrupted segments of discrete thoughts. We tend to experience consciousness in a flow of ongoing experience. Now, in some cases, when people have very specific forms of brain injury, for example, where their short-term memory has been impaired, sometimes severely, one of the things that is so distressing to people who have that kind of brain injury is that there is no stream of consciousness. Everything is a discrete moment. Sometimes when I've taught introductory psychology, I use this really heartbreaking footage of a man who had encephalitis, and his short-term memory system, the parts of his brain that were responsible for that, were completely obliterated. And so he lived constantly in a moment of time where every moment was like waking up. And he couldn't connect one thought to the next thought to the next thought for an orderly, kind of systemic way of seeing the world. For James, his theory is founded on the idea that every thought shapes the thought that comes after it. And that's kind of the way thoughts are tethered together. As you experience your world, you're having thoughts, some of them subconscious, some of them very conscious, some of them lurking just under the surface, but they're there, and the thought you have in moment one is going to influence the thought you have in moment two. Whatever is going on in the present moment is who you are at that present moment. So this connects to personality in a very, he has this sense that personality is never all that fixed because it is dependent on the stream of consciousness that is functioning right at that moment. So who you are at any given moment, whether you're conscious or not, that is personality. So he expected fully that human beings would be changeable in terms of their personalities. Thoughts, as they emerge, are going to be modified in terms of what's the focus, what's the specific cognitive content, and where they're going. So I often looked at it as seeing, here's where you have intersections between motivation, cognition, and emotion. And the stream of consciousness is keeping all of those domains kind of functioning in a way that serves to give us a coherent sense of who we are from one moment to the next moment to the next moment. And that, leaves us with this statement that your authors make: in consciousness, the stream is continuous. So when people are healthy, as I said, when they have intact cognitive functioning, when they have intact motivational structures, they have intact emotional structures and behavioral structures, their experience of consciousness is a continuous flow. He suggested that, he was interested in psychedelics, for example, and he said, you can manipulate this stream. You can either intensify the streaming experience in terms of stream of consciousness, you can intensify certain elements of it, or there are chemicals that interrupt it completely and make it less functional in terms of the person's identity. Even when there are, when we sleep, we perceive gaps in consciousness. When we are inattentive or overwhelmed, we may experience gaps in consciousness. But because we are so strongly evolved to think in a way that is unified through this stream of consciousness, we might not experience discontinuity, because what we tend to do is rebuild the gaps. We fill in the gaps by using what we know already to be true, what we've experienced in the past, predictions about ourselves for the future. We use all of those things to fill in gaps in our consciousness so that we don't feel disconnected. And that concludes part one of my coverage of William James.